Life, through genes, forever seeks the best. This is reflected in man's religions, myths, arts, and dreams. A man said, when we say that some particular animal is intelligent, all we're saying is that we can make it do things it wouldn't naturally do. And his writing companion replied, is this not also the intelligence of a mystic as regards what he causes his mind to do? Artists who, as they put it, deal in pain are kitty artists. Yep. Neither genes nor genius traffic in such. When they let the sarcasm out of one man, he could no longer participate in Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Thoughtful men seem to gain in wisdom through discourse with their fellow man, while a mystic does so alone. This is reflective of two different neural schematics. One man's personal operative dictum was, don't kill yourself. He admits he stole it from his own tombstone. The commercial and popularity factor as regards nonpartisan ideas. If you're not selling, people tend not to be buying. If the mystical way were an organized institution, its main tenets might well be to require of oneself and to encourage, when possible, others. All creative people are also crazy, except the ones sane enough at the time to point it out. If it were possible to change life, which, as normally conceived of, it is not, it would have to be done inside out, compared to the common conception, that is, commencing in you and then turning outward. A certain mystic once noted, you know your seasons are changing when, in the morning, you find leaves on your living room floor and dead dreams by your bed. Regardless of conventional theory, there is no such thing as positive anger at the mental level. A monk told some recent arrivals, the older becomes the mystically touched, the more they're inclined to insanity. Kind of presents a challenge, what? The only thing that can't be profitably made fun of on this planet is all non-human and human activity. More conscious thought is unique in that it doesn't take sides, something not possible at routine levels. One man discarded all of his mottos for just this one. Never let it be said. Even those who have no visible pets yet have one at home. And to be inattentive or unkind to it is a coarseness unworthy of a human. A certain mystic once asked himself, in expanding the boundaries of one's thinking, which is of greater use, metaphor or symbol? Words, the feet of thought, can either walk or run, then later fly. A real human doesn't need modifiers, especially in describing himself. Everything wears a mask, even knowledge. A mystic is one engaged in backstage wardrobing. The rebirth of consciousness is like the supreme final cream filling in the harsher outer pastry of ordinary mental existence. As regards all mystical matters, the idea is revolutionary, its execution futuristic. I have a new version, another version of a new myth from recent days. It was this alien mystic from another planet went to this other planet and began trying to get some of the creatures who would listen to expand their conception of what life was about. Tried to tell them what life was about. And after some time there, if you recall, he had a friend from the home planet came to visit. Came to some of these public speaking engagements, appearances of his buddy, observed it for a while, and then said, "You know, that must be driving you nuts, having to beat around the bush like that." You recall? And in the first version, the guy said, "Yeah, but what are you going to do in a three-dimensional reality?" New version. Same setup. His friend comes to visit, listens to what he has to say, the way he's handling it, and he says, "Jesus, I wonder you're not nuts, having to beat around the bush like that." And the guy went, "Well, what you call beating around the bush is actually an initial protecting of their senses so that they can later see and hear even more." Second version. Pick up what we were talking about last time. And that is that a good place to pick up of all mystical knowledge. As regards all mystical knowledge, all mystical info, there's two things. The ideas are always revolutionary. Their execution always futuristic. And the ideas, such information, as I was pointing out, can be heard by humans and is heard at two levels. It is heard literally and it is heard metaphorically, or it is heard physically and it is heard metaphysically. And a model, I was going to drag two or three things into it, but to go ahead and, if you consider the literal side, so we made a cord of this, like a cable, like a coaxial cable sort of, and we've got two strands here, kind of alternating and wrapped around it. I assume it shows up on TV. This is like the genetic core, unchanging, is unending, and this is like the literal taking is partisan thought that is always wrapped about it. And I made two different colored strands here to coincide with the fact that it takes three forces to apparently make anything happen in a three-dimensional reality. After that is once said, even after religions once establish that, they then ignore the third part, other than through lip service, which would be this, in the way in which I was going to try and talk about it for a moment, and these two would be like the other two forces. If you recall, I was using a good example, as good as any. I used the idea of the mystic known as Jesus, and the idea that he presented, one of them, they said, "Tell us something great, tell us something astounding, some idea." Anyway, and he said, "Love those that make themselves your enemies." Well, love thine enemies. Now that was heard at two levels. It was heard literally and it was heard metaphorically. The ordinary heard it literally, and it sounded to them as though it were a call for behavior modification, which was astounding enough, which is, by all ordinary men, an impossible task. But they took it literally, they took it physically, as astounding as that was. Assuming that we had people who asked him and took what he said in a quite sincere manner when he said, "All right, the best thing I could tell you, if you want something to really extraordinary, is love people who hate you." And as last time I pointed out, they initially had the shock of that being completely contrary to what would appear to be, or what was, physical, cultural, judicial reality of the time, and still extant now, of an eye for an eye. Hate those that hate you, and those that are nice to you, tolerate them. But it was completely contrary to the idea of an eye for an eye, retaliation. But the ordinary ear heard it physically. It was enough of a shock that was in contradistinction to an eye for an eye, the prevailing attitude toward how to handle those who mistreat you. But then they heard it, those who took it in some way sincerely, those that it struck them as being of some potential significance. They heard it as a call for behavior modification. They heard it physically. Even though they couldn't do it, they just heard it physically, and it still survives. It still survives and is recounted. It is still given great weight in various forms throughout the world, not just amongst Christians. That is in some way astounding if you could do it. It is in some way beneficial to even try. It's at least beneficial to pay your own lip service to it, to repeat it yourself. But there was more afoot. That all information that has ever been termed mystical, astounding, world-shaking, world-shaping, transcendental, all of this is always a reflection of man's future. But it reaches him in the way that it is always heard on two levels. The ordinary hear it physically. They hear it as a physical, literal dictum, statement, proverb, direction, such as love your enemies. And at the ordinary level, that sounds plain enough, and it calls for a change in behavior. It refers to physical action. The few people hear it another way. But notice at the physical level, doesn't require much repetition, not even as much as I've done, but you do understand the ordinary people, including yourselves. And at the ordinary level, we are talking about the bio-survival level. We're talking about the level at which humans are just barely humans. At that level, there is no such thing as love your enemies. It is running in natural opposition to that which is necessary for the bio-survival of the organism, of man. That you're not supposed to love your enemies. You're at least supposed to flee them, supposed to fight them. You're supposed to oppose those forces that oppose you. The few heard it at another level. They heard it as being a means to reroute the normal neural processes and genetic flow at the bio-survival level. That's why it's astounding. Notwithstanding the fact that it is astounding at the crude level, at the first level, that ordinary people can hear it and believe that it is no more than a call for a change in behavior. But it's astounding on the basis, if you recall I was trying to point out to you, that even though people cannot do it, they will not relinquish the idea. They cannot abandon it. It is not something that they have psychologically or spiritually or philosophically adopted. It was put upon them. It is not something that they had some choice. Well, maybe we'll believe this for a while. That is the reason that certain ideas continue to be part of man's collective consciousness. So it's astounding on the basis that no one can do it. No one can claim to do it, no sane person. No one sees any hope on the horizon that they're going to be able to do it next week, next year, and yet they continue to give it great weight. So it's astounding on that level. It should be astounding for someone just to, here and there, to make that notation. Normally people who would even get close to such an observation turn out to be balloons in the Macy's parade. That is, they turn out to be full of sarcasm and cynicism and go, boy, listen to those Christians or whatever group they're picking on and say, going around talking about love thy neighbor. Look at the history. Look at the Inquisition. Look at Cardinal Fang. Look at what they've done to all the other people. In other words, point out the irony. But see, they miss the point. The astoundingness is not that humans act in fashions that continue to keep the word ironic in the dictionary and alive. That's not what's astounding. What they should see, if they could get in that certain little crack, they wouldn't even have to be a mystic. It'd just be an unusual intellectual position for someone here and there to realize that what's astounding is that even though no one can do it, no one can turn loose of it. And it continues to have an effect. They should find that at least worthy of some very serious in private. But normally when it gets to that kind of area wherein there is no available polarized or polar-based answer, people normally then become cynical. That is the beginning, that is the basis of sarcasm, irony, satire, parody, hostility, criticism of all sorts. It's like people are saying one thing, either individual or large groups, and they're saying one thing and they're not doing it. They're proclaiming one goal and then they're going in some other direction. And they continue to miss the path that they say they've laid out, and they won't stop. And they're hypocrites. They're idiots. They're fools. It's astounding. They should find, if they could keep from being sarcastic and hostile about it, they should find it astounding that there are such ideas that hold on and on and on, and people cannot shake it, and no one can do it. That's what they should go, rather than worry about whether they're going to be full enough to make the parade this November. Beyond that, up to the other level of those who hear it metaphorically, mythically, metaphysically, it is then super astounding. So astounding that all I can do is jump in and, with your prior knowledge that words are not going to adequately cover it, this gets so far removed that there's no sense beating around the bush. You just jump in, let it splice, and try to let your mind get a little wet with new water or new fluids. Not necessarily water, although most people's brains will not rust from water. Little known fact. Of course, the reason being it's of no value, but there it is. The ordinary, the few compared to the ordinary, here, let's take that same example of love your enemies. It now becomes just super duper, rooper duper, hooper, cooper, zooper astounding. That means real astounding. That is, they hear the idea, to stick with this one example, and it's been put other ways, but let's take this one. Love your enemies. Now, anyone who can hear it at the mythical level, at the core level, they immediately understand the other level, how astounding it would be if it indeed were no more than a call for a change in behavior. They understand, oh yeah, hey. You hear that immediately. What they then hear is it offers a means, whether they can analyze it in this particular manner. The reason that they're attracted to it, they do understand this would offer a means that if you did that, what it would do is reverse the flow of energy native to a human. Mm-hmm. Now, we're not talking anymore now about religion, spirituality, morality, behavior modification. We're talking about strictly an internal, and it's a process here, as much as we can separate, which I'm going to have to do to talk about it. It's here as opposed to down in here, because you should not be reversing, you should not be interfering with the normal flow, the genetic flow, that says do not. Of course, it doesn't say this in words, but it says do not love your enemies. At that level, there's nothing in a sane person that says, love your enemies. That is, a man walks up to you with a knife, and you go, how would you like me to stand? Where did you get the best shot? Or to hug him and pull him close so he can drive it deeper into your stomach. No. There's nothing there that says that. So, just using that as a comparison is why I point here. They understand, or they would comprehend, they would suspect that this offers a means. If you did that, what that would be doing is absolutely reversing the normal, the natural chemical processes here. And that, again, a man does not have to analyze to begin with, but that's exactly what would-be mystics are after. They're not after changing their behavior. They're not after pleasing someone. They're not after moving up the church hierarchy. They're not after moving up some kind of level that they're graduated in some kind of mystical group or some monastery. They're after none of that. What they're after is something internal. They're after something that is quite personal and individual, and it's here. And what could be more astounding? super duper, rooper, cooper, zuper, astounding, than taking the processes that drive the human intellect, driving that thing which makes man singular, and as a certain monastery, as they used to call it, reverse the sons of bitches. Is take that flow and run it in an absolutely unnatural direction. That is the reality. We're talking about electrochemical areas. We're talking about laws of physics. We're talking about the reality of physics. We're not talking about the reality or the theology of religion or morality. We're talking about reversing the flow. We're talking about rerouting it. I say reverse several times. That's just give you a crude place to jump. It's even more astounding than that, but that's astounding enough for the ordinary mind to consider. All right, could you consider that you could run time backwards? I'm not comparing. I'm just trying to get you to get an idea that you can run age backwards, that suddenly tomorrow that you can start getting younger rather than older, which I guess some of you will notice all of these, I'm sure, in some way have been covered in science fiction. But that you'll get tomorrow and become younger, start getting younger every day rather than older, or that you look at the clock and it's running backwards now, or that you drop something and it goes up. All of that is just normally considered to be not possible. In the same way, I just wanted you to understand, it is not any less so the physical reality behind loving your enemy. It takes the process that wraps around the unchanging genetic core that is life. You know, just consider, I cut this off. The center part, there is no end, there's no beginning as far as the mind's concerned, which you can check your own Old Testament or whatever story you like of creation myth. It just goes on and on. But about it is wrapped two other forms of energy. That's why, you know, like I cut it off, and there's the core, and here are the other two forces that go on. What you would be doing, if you could love your enemies, is you have separated yourself in a sense. Well, consider this. You could consider that this central core, look at it as being a kind of cable. I guess they'd call it a coaxial cable, or one example. And consider this is the two external strands. I just separate them enough that you could see, but they're wound tight around this center part. Now you could consider the external, that this to be a fair model, the external, those two could represent every idea from good and evil, Yahweh and Lucifer fighting, Allah and Satan. It is all forms of partisan thought, and they're always temporal. And the reason I went to the trouble to make them overlap is like one time the red's on top, then the blue's on top next time, then the blue, and then the red. That there is no, although I alternated them, there is no real predicting to it. There is no useful predicting to it. They just continue to encompass the permanency, the unchanging, in a sense, permanency of the genetic core of life. To try and love your enemies is to separate yourself. Physically, it would help. Whether it happened immediately, as so often people like to recount the great mystical experience, or whether it, like in showbiz, that people point out, yeah, I'm an overnight success with my new hit record. I've only been out playing Holiday Inns and the roadhouses for 30 years, but yeah, I got a hit record and now I'm an overnight success. So that's not dissimilar to all the people that suddenly, the great mystical experience, and it just so happens sometimes they maybe don't see fit to point it out, or they temporarily forget that they've been working on it for 40 years. But it is to free oneself. If you could love your enemies just suddenly, this is love your enemies. This is hate your enemies. This is an eye for an eye. This is treat every man as yourself. This is all of civilization. This is man's intellect. This is everything that is civilization. The outer strands are, when I draw my little diagram of the human nervous system, just going in a different kind of spatial direction, the level of consciousness in a man would be the same as the two external strands taken together with the core. It is a continual struggle, like between life and death, good and evil, up and down, all of the ever popular, not to discount them, but the ideas of a struggle of some sort going on. People do not normally give any particular importance to the idea of up versus down and inertia versus centrifugal force or momentum. They only find it to be of importance when it gets into the area that is singular to man. That's why I was using good and evil, because you don't have to be religious, but proper and improper. How does someone become your enemy? They treat you improperly. Below the level of consciousness, when you don't need to think about it, is the man with the knife, is a bear jumping out of a tree at you. The bear or the man with the knife is your enemy. There's nothing to be said at that level. It is when you get to the partisan strands, the external strands around this, which is comparable to the level of consciousness above that. It is there that you have such ideas take on pragmatic, practical possibilities, is love your enemies. Because there, in a sense, it is possible. We've moved from the ordinary realm because ordinary people can't do it. You already know that. You can't do it at the ordinary level. But you're at the level now to where, practically speaking, it does not really matter. To love your enemies at the mental level will not shorten your life. If we were ordinary health, if you were health nuts, I could add contrary. It might make you live longer, but I don't want to disappoint some of you that little sidebar humor. Very little, I know. At this level, the external strands, the partisan strands of good and evil, of those who, like fellow Jews, fellow Christians, fellow Muslims, fellow Buddhists, fellow Italians, and then those who are not. At that level, it has no direct bearing on one's bio-survival potential if you are a Jew, if you're a Christian, if you are a Muslim, if you are an existentialist, or if you are a humanist. It makes no difference. Except at the ordinary level, an ordinary man could not even say whether it makes any difference. He would just say, well, you got to be something. Very likely he wouldn't use those words, but if you tried to get an ordinary man to consider, if you said, do you take it to be a matter of some urgency, of some importance that you are a Muslim? And he says, yes, I do. And you say, well, do you happen to know some Jews and Christians that are friends of yours? Or do you have friends? He may say, yes. Now, have in-laws. Do you find them to be just as good a people as you are? As your religion is, your culture? And he says, well, yes. And you say, well, do you think it could be of some interest? Could be maybe a curious experiment, what it might do to your outlook on life. You're intelligent, and I know that you read philosophical books, and etc. What if you tried to, not externally, you don't tell anybody, but what if internally you stopped being a Muslim and you tried to become a Jew? That you know enough about, I know you're well read enough, and if you tried that, or you tried to be nothing. I better stick with my first example. To become a Jew or a Christian, because his feeling would be, the reason I backed off, his feeling would be, if he followed that wait a minute, assuming that he realized I was not picking on him and saying there's something wrong with being a Muslim and that you'd be better off to be a Jew or a Christian or something else, and assuming that he realized that, his feeling would be, well, not only why should I try that, it'd be a little past that. Probably he wouldn't be able to analyze it, but his feeling would be, wait a minute, if I did that, it'd be like I ripped off the mask, and I'm named the Phantom of the Opera. If I rip it off, under there is what? And the feeling is nothing. Now you know enough that even in your own mind, you do not analyze things normally that way. But he could not, in any reasonably intelligent or sane manner, respond to that. Not only, you understand, it's not just that he would say, well, why should I? Because up until I got to the punchline, he might go along and feel like, well, that does sound interesting. If I said, well, how about this just as an interesting intellectual speculation? What if a man took the things that seemed to be important to him, his religion, his culture, his race, his nationality, and what if, not externally, let's get past that now, because that would be child's play. Plus, it would not be productive in any way. It would be counterproductive to most people. But if I got him to say, to go along with the idea up to a point verbally, if I said, what if you tried to abandon, or if you tried to change, just secretly, in here, and you tried to think, you tried to feel, just in private, more like, instead of whatever he was, a Buddhist, more like a Hindu. And you know enough about it, you know what they think. You've written articles on the general Hindu belief system. Yeah. Well, wouldn't it be interesting to actually try it? I don't mean for a second, but try just internally to abandon what you are now. Nothing wrong with it. And to adopt another one. Understand, we're not talking about another person. We're talking about the operation of the human intellect. So all you got to do is check with yourself now. Without being able to put it in words, the attitude of him, that is, the ordinary mental processes, would not be, why should I, or what would it benefit me, but it would almost be frightening. It would be like, well, it doesn't compute. Even after I got him to agree. If I said, now, you've got friends who are, if he was a Buddhist, you've got friends who are Hindu. Oh, yes. Married one, my wife, my mother-in-law, love them. Nothing wrong with them. They're beautiful people. I could have been. It was just a matter of, I guess, geography right here, that I was just, my village was few, my family just happened to be Buddhist, and hers was Hindu. I'm surrounded. Well, as intellectual as you are, and as much as you've tried meditation and reading, and I know you've traveled around, internally, what if you tried to adopt the Hindu, just entirely, that you tried to adopt the Hindu belief system, the Hindu psyche into your psyche, and just set yours aside? It would be, the kind of person I'm describing, it would be not so much a switching of one to the other, and it would be, and up to that point, I might have his attention like, well, this sounds interesting. But if I pushed it like, not just us sitting here drinking coffee, and you think about it a second, to actually undertake that, to give up your reading of mystical books and attempted meditation and etc., take that as being your form of the great mystical work. It would then be, without the mind being able to analyze it, like, no, something's terribly wrong, because the thing would be of ripping away a mask of some kind and not replacing the Hindu mask with Buddhism or the Islamic mask with Judaism, but I'd rip it off and there's nothing. What's the mind saying? It is saying, without partisan thought, there is no thought. Without me having enemies, I'm nobody. Now, enemy is taking the widest sense of the word. How can you be a Muslim unless there are at least a few infidels left? How can you be a Jew unless there are at least a handful of Gentiles left? How can you be a Christian unless there's some pagans somewhere? You cannot think. The genetic core of reality, that which is unchanging, that which man continues to dream of and call God and all sorts of names, you could not be conscious of it without the external strands, without being wrapped in that which causes one to have opposition, to have enemies. Then for someone to come along and say, all right, do you want something astounding? And the mysticism, one way to describe the whole idea of mysticism is you're trying to get in touch You're trying to hear the genetic core speak. Everybody else, I know for years, they keep wanting to say, well, I want to hear the voice of the universe. I want to speak. I want to join in union with God, with the Godhead. I want to be able to hear the forces of creation actually speak. It's that, and it doesn't speak in any known language. It doesn't speak in words. But notice it is wrapped in the very things, the reality of the human intellect. Without this, without the external strands, you would not want to hear this. You would have no idea of mysticism. And yet, the beauty of it being, or for those of you that are sort of tired of the beauty of it, the way it is. I'll leave it to you to decide. Without the external strands, it would be impossible for you to want to get in touch with this. But as long as you're here, you can't get in touch with this. That's what I keep referring to as the beauty of it. And some of you who begin to get glimpses, I notice that you kind of, like, I don't know what's so beautiful about it. The justice. Or just the way it is, and you decide. You understand that out here is where you cannot love your enemies. Out here is where you're not supposed to love your enemies. At the intellectual level. Again, we're not talking about the physical level. We're talking about at the level of human consciousness. In this sense, animals, the highest animals on this planet, do not have this situation. They're simply operating here. Or put more precisely, this is operating through all of us, and it's operating through them without this addition. It is the genetic core running life itself. Trying to love your enemies is physically, not spiritually. It is chemically, physically, electrically, just physically should cover it. Is going against the very thing that is making you ask the question. Going against the very thing that says, I would love to be mystical. I would love to know what life's about. If this is what life's about, I want to know what it is. I want to know what the secret is. The very thing that asks what the secret is the thing that cannot hear the secret. It is the very thing that has enemies, and if you don't have enemies, you can never say, I'd like to know the secret of life. You could never think or feel that there would be great benefit in loving your enemies unless you had enemies. You got to first have enemies. You do understand, I'm using enemies now to take the example of Jesus and the idea of love thy enemies. Enemies now represents the ordinary workings of the human intellect. Without this, you have no desire, no knowledge of trying to get away from it. But if you can't get away from this, you'll never get away from it. The idea of love your enemies, the idea was astounding, revolutionary. To quote myself, all mystical information, besides being heard at two levels, is like two different stages itself, or two different levels, beyond it being heard at two different levels. That is, it presents itself, the idea, whatever it is, but any mystical notion, any mystical information, the idea, or ideas, to begin with, is revolutionary. Secondly, the execution of the ideas is futuristic. It is not going to be realized at the time. You could consider, how about this, all of the religions being the physical, being the more literal representation, the more literal hearing, and then the physical manifestation of something that was originally metaphysical, something that was originally mythical. You could look at all the world's major religions quite validly from an ordinary view as being outgrowths of attempts at reform movements of original religions, of older ones. Every one of them. It's not a history lesson, but I'm trying to get you to consider something about the human intellect again. But you surely know everything from Confucius. And Lao Zong they were rebelling against the same kind of things that Muhammad, when it was 2,600 years later, 1,000 years later. Same thing that Buddha was doing as regards Hinduism, same thing that Jesus was doing as regarded Judaism, the same thing that Judaism had done off and on for 2,000 years before that. It was all attempts at the older religions, and older religions, there's nothing particular to call them, but the older beliefs of the Jews trying to, the ideas of Abraham and Moses trying to take all this, the polygod, the nature worship, Muhammad being confronted with temples with hundreds of gods, one for every day of the week. They were all attempted reform movements. And Buddha tried, if you recall, he tried to follow the general Hindu ideas, both common and more esoteric. And so what ended up, whether they intended or not, the religions ended up being a kind of reflection of what was originally an attempted reform movement. After all that, does anybody see any direct connection between what we're talking about? Rome originally forbid Christianity. Then you move past your little calendar there, your little flow chart of history. It wasn't long before, not only were they not forbidding it, it was required. That is how the religions, the connection I was trying to get you to see is the idea itself is always futuristic. Love your enemies. It is revolutionary to start with, but its execution, its realization is futuristic. It is not going to be possible. So one of the ways that it becomes part of the lingering, the continuing consciousness of a people is it becomes codified into a religion. That is part of the way that they hold on to something that they cannot possibly do, and they know they can't, and they can't turn it loose. The comparison I made last time was people once, if they were dumb enough or tried it one time, if you said, wave your arms and maybe you can fly like a bird, they realize they can't. And only a fool, only somebody who was just an idiot, would continue and think, well, if I practice enough, it just strikes them either after trying it once or just hearing the idea. They go, no, no, no. You could practice hours a day forever and you'll never fly. And so they forget it. You can't keep a sane man's interest in that. So then you ask, or you should ask yourself, then how is it they will take something such as love your enemies, and it, in a sense, it is no more possible for an ordinary man to do that than it is for him to fly. But he will not continue to talk about flying, not by waving his arms. But he will continue to talk about, give great weight, pay great lip service to an idea that's not possible. One of the ways that it is made compatible with ordinary existence is it becomes part of the collective's intelligence. It becomes codified, it becomes institutionalized, it becomes, in this case, a religion. And it apparently is an attempt to reform, to expand some older religion. That is, try it again, the information is always revolutionary. It was revolutionary even on the basis, the physical basis, when they first heard, love your enemies. It was revolutionary on the basis that if this is a call for behavior modification, this is friggin' revolutionary. Because up until then, it was established. It was the code. It was their religion. It was their way of life. It was their part of their judicial system. It was believed by the priests and the rabbis. They taught that God said this. Said it right here. He said 2,000 years ago, an eye for an eye. So here's an idea that at the very least you could call revolutionary. Not an eye for an eye, love your enemies. It's revolutionary, but its execution is always futuristic. It is always out of reach. It is yet to be. Those two things are always extant in mystical info. Always. That when it's first heard, it is revolutionary. But its execution, the realization of the idea of it actually coming to be, is always somewhere down the road. It is always futuristic, because that's what the info was to start with. It was a reflection of where man is going. I was trying to get you to consider how man is able to hold on to these two conflicting realities. That he seems to be not just paying lip service, even though he does. It is more than something that's been acquired. That is now the idea of love your enemies is some part of man's genetic makeup. It is not just something that's been acquired, because you do not have to be a Christian for it to have an effect on you. How can he hold to two realities, and they're not just in opposition in the ordinary sense, like saying, well, I want to be a Baptist, and yet I love to drink, and they say you can't drink. I'm not talking about those kind of opposition. That's easy enough. You just don't let the people in the church know about it. You know. Living with those two kind of opposing forces are, yes, I love to be married and have a wife and somebody to take to the Christmas party, but boy, I like to screw around the weekend with strange waitresses and girls I pick up. I'm not talking about anybody can live with that. If that breaks you should have been stressed out anyway. You're not any kind of man or woman. That wasn't just a joke I was trying to make you see. In psychology, it's known that there is great difficulty. In fact, it can lead to nervous disorders of even a psychotic nature to try and live with those kind of two conflicting internal drives of trying to be a good husband or trying to be calling yourself a follower of some religion that says you cannot do so-and-so, you cannot drink, commit adultery, and every night of the week you're drunk and trying to pick up an extra marital partner. They say that that's stressful or that is dangerous. No. See, I just use that, not to make a joke, but that is what is called trying to live with conflicting internal drives or opinions or behavioral models. Now the real one I'm pointing out is even the mind doesn't even look at it this way. But how to live with such ideas as love your enemies, and it not only just live with it, not just pay lip service, even though I kept saying people do. It is something they cannot shed themselves of. They cannot shake it. They cannot talk their way out of it. They can deny that they are a Christian. They can deny that they're religious. And that the ideas, such as, just for one, love your enemies, it is a part of the human existence, not of any particular culture, even though I use the words of Jesus and supposedly of Christianity as a diving board to jump from, but it is not limited to any culture, any people. So there it is, something that people are tied to and they can't do. And it's not something that they're trying to work out. They've had thousands of years to realize, we can't do this, but we can't seem to get rid of the idea. We're stuck with it. Of course, rather than say stuck with it, we're talking about something running through everyone, no matter who you are. I was trying to get you to consider the way they live. That is the real, quote, living with conflicting ideas or living with conflicting models. This is the real one, because it's not as simple as being a Baptist versus being a drunk. There's being a good husband, being faithful to your marriage vows versus being a weekend nymphomaniac. I mean, it's not it's not as simple as this or that, those kind of ordinary. See, this is more refined. And the way it normally comes about, the way that it is normally handled, is through being part of an institution, being part of the normal civilization. I slipped in one tonight that said, thoughtful men normally seem to gain wisdom through discourse with one another. It has been a tried and proven method. It is all the way from large groups of people. Chinese philosophers 3,000 years ago reckoned them having students, all the way to the Indian idea of a personal guru, all the way to Greeks sitting around in large numbers of people discussing things, all the way down to you back in college, you and one of your good friends sitting up all night drinking heavy-duty coffee and discussing the nature of life. That it seems to be that ordinary people gain in wisdom through some kind of discourse, of talk, and one man brings up one opinion, somebody something else. They compare ideas, and other people join the discussion. It goes on for months, for years, for lifetimes. And yet a real mystic accomplishes the same thing alone. There was a connection. It is part of the purpose. It is part of the utilitarian purpose of man the collective, of the herd, of being part of some group. I can make it sound more critical right here at the end to try and get your attention. It helps ordinary people to get past having to live with this kind of quite extraordinary contradiction within themselves. Do you believe, I'm asking of God now, do you believe that probably the deep purpose or the greatest ideal that a man could strive for was if an individual, a man was capable of loving people that despised him? And the guy goes, yeah, I do. And I go, can you do it? And he goes, well, no. And I said, well, do you really believe it? And he goes, oh, yeah. You're not the first, you asked me that. That didn't mean anything. I've thought about that for a long time. I have worked on that. I've done all sorts of things. And I said, well, and you consider that to be of extreme importance. Yes, I do. And you can't do it. No. And if I tried to say something like, well, doesn't that kind of drive you nuts? Doesn't that bother you? Now, don't just laugh, but the answer, this part of the purpose, he said, well, no, I'm a Catholic. Not that a Catholic is anything to be laughed at. The point is, he's got something to fall back on. That I'm part of an organization. He doesn't have to go into it. If he would assume that you were sophisticated enough, I guess, that by saying, well, I'm a Catholic. The point being, in this case, the Pope would not claim that he can love his enemies. The Pope would have to say, if he was a good Pope, he would say, no, none is perfect save God in heaven. None is perfect save the one who sent us this dictum of love your enemies. Only he can do it. Only God can do it. Only Jesus could have done it. No, I can't do it. We strive for it. But you understand, and you ask, wait a minute. It looks like it'd drive you nuts if you really say that's the most important thing in your life. And you can't do it. Are you any closer than you ever were? If he was intelligent enough to understand discounting growing older and caring less. If you discount that and you say, can you actually, through your own understanding, can you say that you're any closer to loving people who despise you? His answer is no. And if you say, well, how can you live with that? How can you say that's the most important thing? No, we're not picking on Christianity, remember. Because I can turn it back to people like you. How can it be that, to whatever terms you use, that you at a very early age, if you're my kind of people, that at a very early age you realize, boy, life can be a lot of fun. You've already discovered sex and drinking and music and all that. And you think, but this other thing, as soon as you read mysticism, as soon as you read a book, as soon as you read something about somebody, you go, that's it. And you realize that's it. And if it came to it anywhere along the way, if you were in a reasonably state of sobriety, anytime through the last 30, 40 years, even in the midst of a first-class orgy and some of the best coke you ever had in your life, suddenly somebody came out of the crowd, come out behind the curtain and went, the mystical thing? You went, yeah. Right now, if you'll leave this party, and maybe you may not even come back. I can't tell you more. Come with me now, and I'll tell you the secret. I'll make you know it. If you're the kind of person I'm talking about, you don't think twice. Yeah, you leave. That's it. No matter who was there, your family, anybody, all your money, you would simply go. When I said I wasn't picking on any particular religion, I can say, all right, are you like that? And let's assume that you go, yeah. And I say, well, how the hell can you stand the fact that you've been that way for X number of years? How can you live with it? It is part of the job of man the collective. He would be a herd animal anyway, we all know that, from the level down, from the level of consciousness. Just at the bio-survival level, man is, not to some degree, I mean, you can just feel it. You don't have to worry about zoology or psychologists. Man is not in the same league with lions, tigers, and cheetahs. That there is a certain kind of domestic inclination at the bio-survival level. But when it gets here, he then has to lean on something because he is being driven by whether we use the example of love your enemies, just the whole idea of being civilized. The whole thing is running at varying times, at least as often as these two overlap each other, that you don't want to be civilized. You don't want to be decent. You don't want to love your enemies. How you live with it, ordinarily, is by being more civilized, is by being more of a collective person. Whether you're physically in the midst of a herd, you could sit by yourself, is sort of the joke about part-time hermits. Nowadays, you could be a hermit and say, I'm going to physically leave the city, the society. It's just rotten. It doesn't give me what I want. But you would move up into the wilds of Idaho. But if you were a decent would-be hermit, you would not do so until you had enough money to get a satellite dish. All that. Well, you would want to keep in touch. You would like to know what's going on, even if it seemed to be a one-way that you just sit there and listen, that you didn't send out. You didn't have a phone so that you could call up a radio station and tell them what you thought, or you didn't have. You don't need that. All you got to do is sit there in your cabin and talk back to the TV. Talk back to yourself. That's the same thing as having Christianity, as having your culture, having your race. If you really get down and get crude and say, well, I don't have to be this or that. I don't have to be a good human. I'm Greek. I'm Indian. I'm Catholic. I'm Jew. And it's not just to make fun of it. That is part of what makes it tolerable for humanity to be driven. Now, I'll quote myself again, the first page of tonight. Life, through genes, forever seeks the best. It is continually seeking and moving toward the best. We'll leave best to whatever best means. This is reflected in man's religions, myths, arts, and dreams. People are trying to be better, not because they have any choice, but religions are not worthy of any attack. Civilization is not worthy of any real criticism, because it is a physical reflection of life continually seeking the best. That's what it's about. But ordinary people, you can't ever reach the best. That is, you cannot ever fulfill, such as love your enemies. You cannot do it. But you cannot stop being driven toward it. And how does ordinary humanity put up with this? To give it an apparent psychological explanation, which is really no necessary explanation, the way people do it is because they do it. But to try to get you to see what I'm pointing toward, the way they put up with it ordinarily is, it's like I'm in the midst of somebody. Which is why I said, the guy says, well, I understand you saying, how can I put up with thinking I should be a real Christian and do what Jesus said do. And I can't do it, but I can say the most important thing in the world, and you're asking me, how can I stand it without going crazy? I'm a Catholic. I'm a Baptist. That is, I am a part of a group. I am a part of a collective mentation, and none of us can do it. But it's like we're all holding hands, we all meet, we're all decent people, my family, my friends, people of my same race, my same culture, my same background. None of us can do it. We're all saying us, no, we can't. But by God, we're here trying. Or at least we continue to talk about it. There's only way to do it. You got to do it individually. There's nowhere to lean. Because what you're trying to do is get away from the very thing that supports everyone else. Not out there, as you know. It's not whether you actually belong to a church or a religion. But this is what keeps everyone else pacified, is the very thing that causes the conflict. Is this or that, yes or no, my friends or my enemies. Well, I hate him, I love him, I'll try to kill him, he's bigger than me, I'll let it go this time. And what you're trying to do, what mysticism is. I suggested last time, I put it as a question, might the ultimate explanation of what the mystical way is, or the ability to be a mystic is, you can start to hear genetic speak, which is a new term I made up, or genetic speak, you understand? Or you can hear the core speak. But the very things that seek out this are the very things that cover it and hide it. And ordinary people hear such ideas as, do things that you can't possibly do, or that you won't do, such as love your enemies. And people hear it as being a call for some sort of astounding, in fact impossible, change in my behavior, whereas a few people hear it as a means that I could reroute. I'm talking about reroute. I could change the flow of energy that is my own genetics. That's the real area of astonishment. That's the only way that it is even anywhere past the point of not being possible. That is, being able to change what you are genetically, is you have got to go in a way that is absolutely a rerouting, that is in conflict of the normal flow. But it's not to please some group. To back to the example, it's not to be a Christian. It's not to make Jesus love you. It's not to make God happy. It's not to make Moses somewhere go, well, by God, I was wrong. You should love your enemies, and it's great that that little guy saw it. See, it's not that. Because you're not trying to be a Christian. You're not trying to make Jesus proud of you. You're not trying to make your enemies go, well, what a nice guy. What you're trying to do is to do something with your own brain chemistry. To do something genetically damn near not possible.